The quiet I was searching for wasn't silence. It was stability. It was the profound, unwavering peace of a system working exactly as designed. For 20 years, my life had been a series of frantic, sleep-deprived battles against chaos. As a senior grid stabilization engineer, I was the man they sent into the wreckage after the storm. The earthquake, or the ice storm, had torn the world back to its dark ages. I have stood in the ruins of substations, the air thick with the smell of ozone and despair, working by generator light for 36 hours straight to bring a hospital back online. I have seen the fragility of the thin electrical web that holds our civilization together. But for me, it was never just a job. It was a penance. I carry the memory of my grandmother, a woman as tough and resilient as the rural Appalachian hills she lived in. She was tethered to life by an oxygen concentrator, a small machine that hummed a constant, life-giving tune. During the great ice storm of '03, the power lines, heavy with a beautiful, deadly crystal, snapped. The power went out. Her backup batteries lasted for 8 hours. The roads were impassable. Help couldn't get through. The humming stopped. My career, my obsession with building redundant, fail-safe systems, was born in the terrible silence of that quiet, cold house. I was determined to build one place on Earth that would never go dark. A fortress of predictability in a world I knew was anything but. I found a house in a community called Aspen Ridge, a picture-perfect diorama of suburban life in the foothills of the Colorado Rockies. The houses were solid, the lawns were immaculate, and the air was clean. My new home was my sanctuary and my laboratory. I reinforced the foundation, installed a state-of-the-art solar array, and, in the basement, I assembled my masterpiece, a custom-designed battery bank and microgrid control system. The final piece, the keystone of my personal quest for resilience, was the wind turbine. It was a sleek, elegant vertical axis model, a silent, sculptural column that would spin on the gentlest breeze, trickling power into my batteries day and night. It was the engine of my peace of mind, a sentinel against the silence. The first assault on that piece came before the installation crew had even packed up their tools. I was in the yard, admiring the turbine's first slow, graceful rotations in the crisp mountain air, when a woman marched across the street with the determined gait of a drill sergeant. She was immaculate, dressed in a crisp linen dress, her silver hair styled in a perfect, unmoving helmet. She clutched a leather-bound clipboard to her chest, like a shield. "I am going to have to ask you to stop," she said, her voice calm but radiating an authority that was absolute and unquestionable. "Immediately." "I'm sorry," I said, turning from the turbine. "I'm Arthur Jensen. I just moved in." "I know who you are," she replied, her eyes not on me, but fixed on the turbine with a look of profound disgust. "I am Evelyn Reed, president of the Aspen Ridge Homeowners Association, and that thing is a monstrosity." I had anticipated some curiosity, perhaps even some questions. I had not anticipated open hostility. "It's a residential wind turbine," I explained, trying to keep my tone friendly. "It's very quiet, and it's designed to be aesthetically—" "It is an industrial eyesore," she interrupted, her voice as sharp as broken glass. "It violates the entire historical aesthetic of this community. Our homes are meant to evoke a timeless mountain lodge feel. Mr. Jensen, not a dystopian factory. The covenants, which you should have read, are exceptionally clear about maintaining a consistent architectural character." "I have all the necessary permits from the city and the utility company," I said, holding my ground. "It passed every inspection." "The city's permits are irrelevant," she scoffed, as if the concept of municipal governance was a quaint suggestion she was free to ignore. The HOA covenants supersede them. That turbine creates a persistent, low-frequency hum that will be a constant nuisance. It is a danger to local bird populations. It will lower the property value of every home on this street." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "My parents lost everything, their entire life savings, because one selfish person decided their vision was more important than the character of the community. One ugly, non-conforming structure was all it took to start the rot. I will not allow that to happen here. Not on my watch." The flash of personal history was unexpected, a brief glimpse of the ghost that haunted her. But it was immediately subsumed by her rigid certainty. She made a neat, angry checkmark on her clipboard. "I am officially notifying you that you are in violation of multiple sections of the Aspen Ridge Covenants. You will receive a formal notice to cease and desist. You will dismantle that machine. This is not a negotiation." She turned and walked away, her back a ramrod of righteous indignation. I was left standing in my yard, the gentle whum, whum, whum of the turbine blades suddenly sounding like a war drum. I had spent my life fighting the chaos of nature. I had battled hurricanes and ice storms. I had never imagined that my greatest challenge would come in the form of a woman with a clipboard, a woman so traumatized by a past loss that she was willing to sacrifice the future resilience of her community on the altar of a perfect and dangerously fragile aesthetic. The first formal notice arrived, as promised, 2 days later, delivered by certified mail. The envelope was thick, the paper inside heavier than any government document I had ever handled. At the top, the Aspen Ridge HOA logo, a serene, stylized aspen leaf, seemed to mock the hostile tone of the text below. "Formal notice of violation and demand to cure," the heading screamed. It cited 3 separate bylaws. Bylaw 8.2 for architectural consistency, Bylaw 11.5 for nuisance abatement due to the disruptive noise, and Bylaw 15.1 for preservation of natural scenery. The notice demanded the immediate and complete removal of the offending structure within 14 days, threatening a fine of $250, followed by an additional $100 for each day of noncompliance. It was signed in a sharp, angry script. "Evelyn Reed, President." My first instinct was to fight back with overwhelming bureaucratic force. I had a thick folder filled with permits and engineering reports. But I hesitated. My battle wasn't just with Evelyn. It was with the ghost of my grandmother. The system I was building was an answer to a personal tragedy, a quiet, solitary mission. The thought of dragging that private grief into a public, petty squabble was deeply distasteful. I chose a path of tactical compliance. I wouldn't take the turbine down, but I would address her specific complaints. I hired an acoustic engineering firm to measure the turbine's sound output. The report confirmed the decibel level was well below the threshold of even the city's most stringent noise ordinances. I submitted the 7-page document of pure, unassailable data to the board. In response, I received a second notice, fining me $50 for submitting unrequested and non-conforming documentation. Frustrated, I spent a weekend and a significant sum of money building a custom, acoustically insulated enclosure around the turbine's base gearbox. I also had the turbine's mast painted a specific shade of heather gray to better match the often overcast mountain sky. I sent a polite letter to the board detailing the steps taken. The response was a third fine for unapproved modification of the unapproved structure. I was caught in a perfect catch-22. That evening, I called Maria, my former FEMA colleague who now ran a disaster planning division for a large West Coast utility. "An aesthetic violation?" she asked, incredulous after I explained. "Art, you once redesigned the entire power grid for Galveston Island on the back of a napkin in a Blackhawk helicopter. And you're being defeated by a woman who's worried about your roofline. It's a different kind of disaster, Maria, I said wearily. The logic is asymmetrical. This isn't just about rules for her. There's a story there. There's always a story, Maria said, her tone turning serious. And you need to find out what it is. But more importantly, you need to go over her head. I've dealt with HOAs like this on community resilience projects. They're black holes of aesthetic obsession. They don't respond to data. They respond to leverage. Check with your city's Office of Emergency Management. See what their disaster plan for your area is. See if you can get your system designated as a community asset. Make yourself part of a system she can't control. Her advice was a lightning bolt of clarity. I had been fighting on Evelyn's turf, by her rules. It was time to change the battlefield. Maria's strategic insight was a welcome reminder of my old life. A life where problems were solved with logic and leverage, not paint swatches. The discovery of the fishing line was a turning point. It was a deliberate act that could have caused thousands of dollars in damage and posed a genuine safety risk. This was no longer about aesthetics. It was a direct attack on my property. My first impulse was to confront her. But years of crisis management had taught me to never act on pure emotion. Instead, I channeled my fury into methodical action. I documented the scene with high-resolution photos before carefully untangling the line. I then took the turbine offline for a full diagnostic inspection, checking the bearing for stress and running a spectrum analysis on the gearbox. As I worked on the roof, my neighbor from 2 doors down, a quiet retired history professor named George, came over. He stood in his yard, watching me with a look of concern. "Everything all right up there, Art?" he called up. "Just doing some routine maintenance," I replied. "Looked like more than routine," he said, lowering his voice. "I saw Evelyn out here earlier, near that oak tree. Seemed to be having trouble with a kite." His words confirmed my suspicions. It was a perfectly deniable cover story. "Thanks for the heads up, George," I said. He simply nodded, a look of quiet solidarity in his eyes. That evening, I felt a profound sense of being under siege. My home, my fortress, felt vulnerable. On the wall was a framed photograph of me, with the mayor of a coastal town after Hurricane Isabella. I had led the team that had restored power to that town. I had faced down the chaos of a natural disaster and brought back order. The absurdity of being laid low by fishing line was galling. The next day, George came over, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Art," he began, "I've lived here a long time. I've seen Evelyn operate. She's a zealot. And to understand a zealot, you have to understand their scripture. You mentioned she talked about her parents losing everything. That sounds like a core trauma to me." George, the historian, was approaching this like a research project. "Let me do some digging. Old newspapers, property records. I have my ways. Maybe if we can understand her past, we can predict her future." His offer was an unexpected lifeline. While George began his research, I followed Maria's advice. I scheduled a meeting with the director of the Aspen Ridge Office of Emergency Management. I laid out my system's capabilities, my schematics, and my vision for a community microgrid. The director, a pragmatic ex-fire chief, was ecstatic. They designated the HOA clubhouse as an emergency shelter and eagerly accepted my proposal to have my system power it, along with key streetlights and the homes of several elderly residents with medical needs. During a grid-down event, we began a quiet, official partnership. A week later, George came back to me, a file folder in his hand. "I found it," he said grimly. "Northwood Estates, 25 years ago. A developer built a series of lovely, modest homes. Evelyn's parents bought one. Then a business owner next door erected a massive, garish, and structurally unsound billboard on his property line, exploiting a zoning loophole. It was hideous. Property values plummeted. The developer went bankrupt. Her parents lost their entire investment. It ruined them. The story explained everything. Her fanaticism wasn't just about taste. It was a desperate, pathological attempt to prevent history from repeating itself. In her mind, my turbine was that billboard, and I was the selfish neighbor threatening to bring her world crashing down. George's intelligence didn't make me feel sympathy, but it gave me a cold, hard understanding of the woman I was fighting. She was not just a tyrant, she was a victim of her own history, and she was determined to make me a victim of it too. Having failed to disable my system through direct sabotage, Evelyn shifted her assault to the court of public opinion. The Aspen Ridge Community Online Forum became her personal platform for a campaign of fear-mongering and slander. Her first post was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive alarmism about the fire risk of large battery systems. The comments section filled with fear. "Should we be concerned? My house is right next to his," wrote one resident. Evelyn was there to stoke the flames with false reassurance. "I am looking into the matter and consulting with experts. I'm sure everything is fine, but it is always better to be informed." The social atmosphere turned frigid. People would see me working in my yard and hurry inside. I was no longer just the eccentric new neighbor. I was a public menace. A week later, Evelyn escalated, posting a link to a sensationalist news article about a wind turbine failing during a storm. A sobering reminder. Her post was titled, "The thought of a piece of metal like that flying through there in our neighborhood is simply terrifying." The lie was breathtaking. The article was about a completely different technology, but the fear it generated was real. My system, designed as the ultimate safety feature, was being successfully rebranded as a deadly threat. The isolation was total. I was completely ostracized. The loneliness was a heavy, familiar weight, reminding me of the silence in my home after my grandmother's death. A silence born of a preventable failure. I retreated to my basement, to the quiet, orderly hum of my system. It was the only place that felt logical. I thought about the sheer, staggering ignorance of Evelyn's accusations. She was warning people about an infinitesimal risk, a risk I had mitigated with a state-of-the-art halon fire suppression system. Meanwhile, the entire community was dependent on a 50-year-old regional substation and a network of overhead power lines vulnerable to every storm. They feared my fortress while ignoring the crumbling empire all around them. I was on the phone with Maria, updating her on the situation. "She's building a public case against you, Art," Maria said, her tone serious. "She's manufacturing consent. She's going to use the fear she's creating to justify her next move. And I guarantee you, her next move will involve official channels." "Let her," I said, a new resolve hardening in my voice. "My partnership with the OEM is already in place. The permits are solid. Let her bring in the officials. It's time someone confronted her fantasy with a little bit of reality." The day the city inspector's truck pulled up to my curb was the day Evelyn decided to weaponize the full force of the municipal government against me. It was a bright, clear Thursday morning. I was in my yard, pruning the roses, when the white truck with the official city seal on the door arrived. A man in a hard hat and a high-visibility vest got out. I felt a strange sense of calm. This was the next logical step, and I was prepared. I had my binder ready, a thick, 3-ring behemoth containing every permit, schematic, and report. The inspector, a burly, no-nonsense man named Frank, met me at the end of my driveway. "Arthur Jensen," he asked. "Frank Miller. City building and safety. We've received a formal complaint from a Ms. Evelyn Reed, alleging an unpermitted and structurally unsound wind turbine and a hazardous battery storage system. I was expecting you, I said calmly, but I think you'll find your information is out of date. Please, come in. I led him into my office. Before we begin the physical inspection, I said, opening the binder, I think this will save us both a lot of time. I walked him through it, page by page. The permits, the engineering reports, the interconnect agreement. Frank scanned each document, his eyebrows rising slightly. This is all in order, he said, surprised. They are, I confirmed. Now, let me show you something else. I flipped to the back of the binder, to a section labeled OEM Correspondence. There was the letter designating the clubhouse as an emergency shelter, my proposal for the microgrid, and the city's official, fast-tracked approval, signed by the emergency management director himself. Frank read the documents twice, a low whistle escaping his lips. A resilient neighborhood microgrid, he said, looking up at me with a newfound respect. I heard about this project in a department meeting. Said it was a model for future community disaster preparedness. He looked back at the complaint on his tablet, then at my binder, a look of profound annoyance crossing his face. So, the complainant, Ms. Reed, the president of the HOA, she's trying to have you dismantle a piece of critical infrastructure that the city's own emergency management office has partnered with you to create. She seems to be more concerned with aesthetics than with disaster preparedness, I said dryly. Apparently, Frank grumbled. Did the HOA board not approve this? They were sent the informational packet from the OEM. I believe Ms. Reed may have overlooked it, I replied. We spent the next hour touring the system. He was, to put it mildly, impressed. This isn't just up to code, he said as we finished. This is built to a standard I've never seen in a residential property. This is military grade. As Frank was preparing to leave, Evelyn Reed herself marched across my lawn, her face a mask of confident expectation. Well, Inspector, she asked, her voice bright with anticipation. I trust you found the numerous and severe violations. Frank Miller turned to face her, his expression grim. On the contrary, Ms. Reed, he said, his voice cold and official. I've found this property to be in exemplary compliance with all city codes. In fact, Mr. Jensen's energy system is a city-sanctioned project in partnership with the Office of Emergency Management. He tapped his tablet. An informational packet regarding this project was sent to the HOA board 2 months ago. I suggest you find it and read it. You are interfering with a critical piece of community disaster infrastructure. He paused. And you are wasting my time. Do not file any more frivolous complaints with my department. He got in his truck and drove away, leaving Evelyn standing in my yard, her mouth slightly agape. Her confident smirk had been wiped from her face, replaced by a look of utter, dumbfounded fury. She had brought in the city to be her executioner, and the city had just named me a civic partner. She turned and looked at me, her eyes narrowing to slits. The look on her face was no longer one of simple, arrogant disdain. It was now one of pure, unadulterated hatred. She had lost the battle of the city. I knew, with absolute certainty, that she would now bring the full, unbridled power of the HOA to bear to ensure she won the war. The final escalation was a declaration of total war, waged on the only territory where Evelyn Reed still held absolute power, the Homeowners Association itself. Having been publicly rebuked by the city inspector, she became a woman possessed. Her singular focus was now my utter and complete removal. She would simply rewrite the law to suit her needs. She called for an emergency meeting of the HOA to vote on a new bylaw. Bylaw 22.7, the Aesthetic Harmony and Safety Preservation Act. It was a piece of legal work so transparently targeted at me that it might as well have been named the Art Jensen Annihilation Act. It explicitly forbade any mast-based structures exceeding the primary roofline, outlawed any external energy generation equipment not factory installed as part of a standard solar panel array, and gave the board the power to demand the removal of any large-scale battery storage system deemed to be a potential hazard, regardless of municipal permits. It was a legal cudgel, designed to give her the unilateral power to force me to dismantle my entire system under threat of crippling daily fines, property liens, and endless, ruinous litigation. The direct threat came in a letter from the HOA's lawyer, outlining the proposed bylaw and the upcoming vote. The final paragraph was pure blackmail, threatening to take my home if I did not voluntarily dismantle my system. My rage was a cold, quiet thing. But as I read her letter, I glanced at the screen of my computer. For days, I had been tracking a massive winter storm system developing over the Pacific Northwest. My professional experience screamed that this was not a typical storm. The pressure drop was too rapid, the moisture content too high. It was a perfect recipe for a blizzard of historic proportions, the kind that snaps power lines and brings a region to its knees. It was projected to hit Aspen Ridge in 2 days, right on the evening of the HOA meeting. Evelyn was going to force her vote in the middle of a potential catastrophe. The irony was so perfect, so profound. It felt like an act of God. I didn't need to fight her bylaw. I just needed to let the storm and the laws of physics do the fighting for me. I spent the next 48 hours not preparing a legal defense, but preparing my system for a severe weather event. I topped off the batteries, ran a full diagnostic on the inverters, and secured the turbine. I also made a phone call to the director of the city's Office of Emergency Management. "Director," I said, "that storm is going to be worse than the national forecast is predicting. The grid won't hold. I suggest you activate the shelter plan and have a fire crew on standby near my neighborhood on Saturday night." There was a pause. "I trust your judgment." "Art," he replied. "We'll be ready." The stage was set. Evelyn was bringing her war to a public forum. I was preparing for a much more elemental kind of conflict. The community clubhouse was an island of anxious light in a world that was rapidly disappearing into a vortex of wind and snow. The blizzard had arrived with a terrifying fury, a wall of white that had descended on Aspen Ridge hours ahead of schedule. The wind howled like a banshee, and the heavy, wet snow was already accumulating at an alarming rate. Inside, nearly every resident was packed into the humid, overcrowded room. They had come to cast their vote, to witness the final, public excoriation of their outcast neighbor. Evelyn Reed stood at the podium, a figure of absolute, unwavering authority. The storm outside seemed only to energize her, providing a dramatic backdrop for her final performance. "Thank you for braving the weather," she began, her voice ringing with self-importance. "It shows how much you all care about the safety, beauty, and integrity of our community." She launched into her closing argument, a passionate tirade against me and my monstrous blight. She spoke of aesthetics, of harmony, of the constant, nerve-wracking hum that was destroying their peace. Her voice cracked with emotion as she said, "I have seen what one ugly, selfish structure can do to a community. I have seen it ruin lives. I will not stand by and watch it happen again. Tonight, we take our community back," she cried, her voice rising over the roar of the wind. "I now call for a vote, all in favor of adopting bylaw 22.7. Hands shot up all over the room. It was a sea of them, a near-unanimous wave of affirmation. A triumphant, cruel smile spread across Evelyn's face as she looked directly at me. "The motion passes," she declared, slamming a gavel on the podium. "Mr. Jensen, the community has spoken. Your machine will come down." At that exact moment, a brilliant blue-green light flashed outside the windows as a transformer on a nearby pole exploded. It was followed by a deep, resonant thump. The lights in the clubhouse flickered violently, once, twice, and then died. Absolute darkness. Absolute silence, save for the howling of the wind and the driving snow. A collective gasp, followed by a wave of panicked shouts. People fumbled for their phones, their small screens creating tiny, useless islands of light. The community, in its moment of unified triumph against a manufactured threat, had just been plunged into a very real and very cold crisis. For a long 10 seconds, there was nothing but chaos. Then, from a large utility closet at the back of the room, came a deep, resonant clunk. It was the sound of my heavy-duty automatic transfer switch, a sound I knew as well as my own heartbeat. It was followed by the low, steady hum of my inverters kicking in. The main lights did not come back on, but a set of dedicated emergency lights, which the city had installed as part of our microgrid plan, flickered to life, bathing the room in a calm, steady glow. At the same time, several dedicated power outlets, marked with bright green covers, lit up. Outside, through the swirling snow, another miracle occurred. The streetlights lining the main road, the ones connected to my system, snapped back on, casting safe, reassuring pools of light into the blizzard. The crowd was stunned into silence. They stared at the lights, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning wonder. Just then, the main doors of the clubhouse swung open, letting in a blast of frigid air and snow. Two figures entered, clad in the heavy gear of firefighters. The man in the lead, the fire chief, swept the room with the beam of a powerful flashlight. "All right, everyone, listen up," his voice boomed. "A blizzard has knocked out the main power grid for the entire region. Power might be out for days. This clubhouse is now the official city emergency shelter for Aspen Ridge. We have heat, we have light, and we have power for charging essential devices and medical equipment." He swept his flashlight beam across the room until it landed on me, sitting quietly in the back row. "And you can all thank this man for it," the chief announced, his voice ringing with authority. "This entire emergency system is running off a dedicated microgrid designed and powered by your neighbor, Mr. Art Jensen, a project he coordinated with the city's Office of Emergency Management months ago. A project," he added, pulling a familiar-looking document from his coat, "that your HOA board was fully briefed on and apparently chose to ignore." He looked directly at Evelyn, who stood frozen at the podium, her face illuminated by the very emergency lights powered by the system she had just voted to destroy. The gavel was still clutched in her hand, a meaningless symbol of an authority that had just been rendered utterly, comically irrelevant. Her face was a canvas of pure, horrified humiliation. The will of the people had spoken, but the laws of physics had just delivered a stunning and brilliantly lit rebuttal. The resolution was not born of bylaws or votes, but of the hard, undeniable reality of a prolonged crisis. The blizzard was historic. The community was snowed in, and without main power for 4 long days. For 4 days, the Aspen Ridge Community Clubhouse, powered by my monstrous blight, became the beating heart of the neighborhood. It was a shelter, a warming station, a place for neighbors to charge their phones and for the elderly to power their medical devices. My home became the unofficial command center, and I, the neighborhood pariah, became an essential resource. The community, forced together by the crisis, began to act like one, their petty squabbles washed away by the unifying force of a real and present danger. Evelyn Reed's authority was not just broken, it was annihilated. She was a ghost in the crisis she had failed to prepare for. The public humiliation was total. After the storm, an emergency board meeting was called. She was removed as president in a unanimous vote. The newly passed Bylaw 22.7 was repealed without a single objection. The shame was too much for her. Within 2 months, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn, and she was gone. A new HOA board was elected, led by George, the history professor. Their first act was to pass a resolution formally thanking me. They then worked with me to apply for state grants to help other residents install battery backup systems and connect them to a larger, more resilient neighborhood grid. My personal project became a community-wide one. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy. But something had fundamentally changed. The neighborhood had been tested, and it had emerged stronger, more connected, and with a newfound appreciation for the difference between superficial appearances and genuine resilience. As for me, I had finally found the stability I had been searching for. It wasn't the quiet, predictable peace I had envisioned, but something far more real and satisfying. I had built my fortress, not just for myself, but for the community I now truly felt a part of. One evening, I sat on my back porch, watching the turbine spin gracefully in the evening breeze. Its low hum, no longer a source of contention, but a quiet, reassuring promise of stability, a promise kept to my grandmother and to my new home.